Having just survived a nightmarish experience in the mirror world, I stood in the shop with my little sister in my arms, looking at the ghost. She had fallen asleep on the way here, and I carefully took her to the back room, laying her down on a couch and covering her with a blanket. Her face, peaceful and serene, made me smile through my exhaustion. When she wakes up, I must reassure her that everything she saw was just a nightmare. Returning to the counter, I found that the ghost had begun telling his story. His face was twisted with anxiety, and his eyes seemed to look through time. He said that someone had stolen his memory stone, causing him to forget his past. He had awakened in an old castle surrounded by cold walls and emptiness, not knowing what to do. A hazy figure from his blurred memories advised him to come to this shop. Mr. Mortimer listened silently and then nodded as if understanding something. He then said, "We would help." The ghost, delighted by these words, began showing us the way to uncover the mystery. However, to be honest, I was on the verge of exhaustion. The recent events in the mirror world had left me utterly drained. Mr. Mortimer, as if reading my thoughts, noticed my fatigue and gently told me to go home and rest with my sister, returning tomorrow. His words were like balm to my soul. I nodded, thanked him for his understanding, and headed home, holding my sister and feeling her quiet breathing. The next day, I left my sister with my aunt and headed to work. When I arrived at the shop, Mr. Mortimer was sitting at the counter reading a book as usual, oblivious to his surroundings. The ghost was hovering beside him. I greeted them and said I was ready to work, but I had a question. How could I look after my sister and work simultaneously? Mr. Mortimer, not lifting his eyes from the book, said that it was a solvable problem. He went to the shelf, moved a few items aside, and pulled out a mask. The mask was ancient and strange, covered with intricate patterns reminiscent of engravings on old artifacts. He handed it to me and suggested I put it on. I examined it, trying to recall from the catalog if I had seen anything like it before, but such a mask was unfamiliar. Curiosity overcame caution, and I put it on. The moment the mask touched my face, it seemed to come alive. I felt it express various emotions: joy, anger, fear. I felt uneasy. The desire to tear it off grew stronger, but suddenly the mask flew off my face and started floating in the air, swaying from side to side. It spun, and a body began to materialize in its place. I watched as my exact copy appeared before me. After all the recent experiences, I was not easily surprised, but I was still shocked. The clone mimicked my every move and spoke in my voice. I reached out and touched him. He was completely tangible. It was a strange feeling to see myself from the outside. I studied my eyes, my nose, which seemed a bit small to me. Suddenly, my clone began to dance like a fool and smirk sarcastically. I thought, "Is that how I look when I laugh? It looks awful." Mr. Mortimer looked at me with a slight smile and said, "Now he can watch over your sister and do your household chores, replacing you. So you don't have to worry. Don't worry, he's very responsible. I will personally keep an eye on him." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and astonishment. Then I asked, "How will we get to the place and what should I do there?" Mr. Mortimer put the book aside and said, "You need a helper." He opened a drawer on his desk and pulled out a skull, which clicked its jaw and began to speak. "Greetings, Master. How can I assist you?" Mr. Mortimer replied, "Yorick, this time you will help our employee Michael with a task. The responsibility is all yours, understood?" The skull turned and looked at me, assessing, and said, "He's still a rookie. Well, okay, if that's your order. Then the skull unexpectedly jumped into the air and landed in my hands. I was a bit startled and nearly dropped it. The shop owner handed me a tied pouch. "Here. It contains a few useful items that might come in handy." I took the pouch, still trying to get used to the strange sensation of holding a talking skull. Meanwhile, Mr. Mortimer said, "Now you can set off. And by the way, it would be good if you picked up a few useful artifacts that you come across." I nodded, wondering what we might find and how we would get to the castle when the shop owner pulled a box from his coat pocket. He took a pinch of powder and, with a flick of his hand, scattered it. It dispersed into the air, forming a portal through which I saw a forest. Looking at it, I realized that my life had definitively turned into a fairy tale. Mr. Mortimer said, "Well, it's time for you to go." Grabbing Yorick, I stepped forward, feeling the world around me begin to change. On the other side of the portal, I immediately felt the air become thick and humid, filled with the scent of moss and earth. Around us stretched a dense forest, its trees reaching high into the sky as if trying to touch the clouds. Looking around, I noticed that the portal behind us had dissolved and disappeared, leaving us with no way back. I wanted to take the first step forward, but Yorick, who was in my hands, suddenly shouted, "Stop! Look at your feet!" I stopped and looked down. Right in front of me was a witch's circle made of mushrooms. Yorick, a bit quieter, added, "A little more, and you could have been transported anywhere on this planet, or maybe even to another dimension." Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, and I carefully stepped over the mushrooms, feeling a shiver run through my body. We followed the path indicated by the ghost who couldn't remember his name. He hovered ahead of us like an ethereal guide, showing the way through the forest thicket. The forest was alive. At every step, we heard strange sounds that seemed both close and distant at the same time. The whisper of the wind in the tree crowns, reminiscent of mysterious voices, made it hard to concentrate. The slight crunch of dry branches underfoot echoed, enhancing the feeling that we were not alone. From time to time, there were strange, low growls and rustling as if someone was watching us from the shadows. Occasionally, the sky was pierced by the piercing cry of a nightbird, sending chills down our spines. I felt the dark eyes of the forest watching our every move. Yorick, despite his inanimate nature, was also on alert. His empty eye sockets glowed with a faint bluish light, as if they saw more than they could say. His voice, now more serious, quietly advised, "Be careful. The forest is full of secrets and traps. Listen to the sounds, but don't let them lead you astray." We ventured deeper into the forest, and the trees grew denser, creating the illusion that the forest was closing in around us. It seemed to have a life of its own, and we were merely guests in its domain. Suddenly, from the shadows ahead, fiery fairies emerged, illuminating the path with their shimmering lights. They silently pointed the way, ascending higher and higher towards the sacred trees, whose light pierced through the darkness. We went further and further until the trees began to thin out, giving way to open patches of moss-covered ground and damp grass. Soon we reached the marshlands. The wet ground beneath our feet began to spring, and with each step I felt my feet sinking deeper and deeper into the mud. Before us stretched a section of the swamp, extending as far as the eye could see. Resembling dark spots on the surface, hidden roots of trees and shrubs created the illusion of solid footing, but it was clear that every step could be perilous. Yorick in my hand spoke again, this time quieter and more restrained. "The marshes are dangerous, but if you know the way, you can get through. Follow him and watch your step." The ghost floating ahead carefully guided us through the marsh. He moved slowly and smoothly, pointing out safe spots for each next step. I followed, trying not to deviate from his route. The first step into the marsh was tentative. I placed my foot on a small island of firm ground, feeling it spring slightly beneath me. Then I cautiously shifted my weight and the ground held. I took a deep breath and made the next step. The process was slow and required utmost concentration. I walked, carefully watching every move of the ghost and testing each foothold before shifting my weight. Suddenly, a water spirit emerged from the marsh before me, its body resembling a translucent silhouette emitting cold. It rose from the water and rushed toward me. I froze, unsure of what to do, but Yorick immediately spoke. "Don't move. Water spirits sense fear. Look directly at it, and it will retreat." I stared at the spirit, trying to suppress my anxiety and fear. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the spirit slowly retreated and dissolved into the air like mist. I sighed in relief and continued. Having crossed the first section, we approached a wider body of water where the water was dark and nearly opaque. The ghost pointed to barely visible roots and stones serving as stepping stones across this section. I carefully stepped on them, sometimes balancing on one leg to find the next foothold. At one moment, my foot slipped and I began to fall into the water. In desperation, I grabbed the nearest root, which turned out to be strong enough to hold my weight. Yorick at that moment advised, "Hold on tight, don't let go. Find the next foothold and shift your weight slowly." Following his advice, I found a stable foothold and slowly regained my balance. Continuing to walk, I felt the marsh trying to pull me in, but thanks to Yorick's and the ghost's instructions, I managed to pass through the most dangerous section. Finally, we reached the edge of the marsh. The ground became firmer underfoot and the moss gave way to dense grass. I stopped, looked back, and saw how unfriendly the marshlands looked behind us. "Excellent work," said Yorick. "Now we can move on." I nodded, feeling tired but relieved. We continued our way through the forest until we reached ancient ruins, half overgrown with moss and vines. The walls were crumbling with time but still held a sense of grandeur and mystery. Yorick pointed to these ruins and said, "There might be useful artifacts here, but they are guarded. Be careful." Carefully looking around, I noticed movement in the shadows between the stones. On closer inspection, I realized that they were snakes guarding the ruins. Their eyes glowed green, and their movements were graceful and almost invisible. "Yorick, why don't ordinary people see these creatures?" I asked, looking at the snakes. Yorick, clicking his jaw, replied, "After you made a contract with Mr. Mortimer, you gained magical sight. Now, you see magical creatures and phenomena hidden from ordinary eyes, the so-called fringe world." We moved slowly and cautiously, trying not to attract the snake's attention. Yorick whispered directions, pointing out safe routes through the ruins. Each step required maximum concentration. I tried to step only on the stones that seemed stable, avoiding those that might be hidden traps. The snakes watched us with their cold eyes, ready to strike at any moment. I felt their tension and malice, as if they were ready to pounce on us at the slightest wrong move. At some point, Yorick said, "Now, use the powder from the pouch. It will help drive the snakes away and give us a chance to grab the artifact." I took a small packet of powder from the pouch. Opening it, I smelled a light but powerful aroma of herbs and spices. Mixing some powder in my palm, I threw it into the air before me. The powder began to settle slowly, and I noticed the snakes starting to retreat as if an invisible force was driving them away. We continued moving, and I saw in the center of the ruins an ancient pedestal, on which lay an artifact, a golden amulet in the shape of a sun disk inlaid with multicolored gemstones. This amulet emitted a soft, warm glow as if holding the power of the sun. I carefully picked it up and felt it fill me with a sense of strength and protection. Yorick confirmed. "Very nice. This is the Amulet of Light. It protects against ghosts." I noticed our guide, who, upon seeing the amulet, made a displeased face and drifted further away from me. Soon we finally reached the castle. Before us rose grim and majestic walls covered in thick ivy and moss. The castle, like something out of an ancient legend, stood amidst the forest, surrounded by mystery and fear. Majestic towers soared high into the sky, their dark peaks lost in the clouds. The castle gates, made of massive wood and reinforced with iron, seemed closed for ages. The castle was built of gray stone, its walls covered in deep cracks, testifying to its age. The windows were narrow and high, most of them broken or boarded up. Large crenellated walls towered over the surroundings, creating a sense of impregnableness. Yorick, sitting on my shoulder, began speaking in a quiet but firm voice. "This castle is called the Castle of Eclipses. Legend says it was built by the great mage Adrian to protect worlds from dark forces. Ancient artifacts and spells capable of changing the course of history are kept within its walls. But the castle was not always a place of light and knowledge. There is an ancient legend that one of Adrian's students, a jealous and power-hungry mage named Maldek, betrayed his teacher. He trapped Adrian in a magical trap and took over the castle, turning it into his fortress of evil. Maldek used the castle's power for his dark rituals and experiments, trapping innocent souls and creating magical artifacts for his misdeeds. The legend also says that on the day Adrian was betrayed, a solar eclipse occurred, and since then the castle has borne its name. Adrian managed to leave several magical traps and spells to protect the castle from complete destruction. He hoped that one day someone would come to free the castle from the dark curse and restore its true purpose. We were admiring the castle's grim beauty when I suddenly noticed movement on one of the walls. Yorick suddenly shouted, "Hide!" Without thinking, I jumped into the bushes. My heart was pounding as I cautiously peered out from my hiding spot. A massive creature was walking on the castle walls. My breath caught. It was a werewolf. So werewolves really exist, I thought, staring at this formidable creature. It was scanning the surroundings, like a guard carefully inspecting the area. If we approached the castle, it would surely notice us. Judging by the skull's reaction, this creature was extremely dangerous. We needed to figure out how to get past it. Yorick, after a moment of thought, finally spoke. "We need to go back into the forest and find a particular herb." I followed his advice, and we set off back. The search took quite some time, but we eventually found the needed plant, wolfsbane. Yorick explained. "Mix this herb with a few others we collected and grind them together." I gathered the indicated herbs and carefully mixed them, grinding them into a uniform mass. Yorick, observing my actions, nodded approvingly and added, "Now look in your pouch. There should be a flute." The flute I pulled out of the pouch looked unusual. Its surface was adorned with intricate carvings, and it had a ring divided into sections, each depicting different creatures. The more I turned the ring, the more new images appeared. It seemed magical, its images coming to life and changing. How this happened I did not know, but Yorick calmly said, "Keep turning until you find the image of a rabbit." I continued turning the ring until I finally found the right symbol. The flute, named the Summoner's Flute, emitted a warm glow. As soon as I saw the right image, I blew into it, producing a pleasant melody. Soon, rabbits started coming from everywhere. They were tame, with soft fur and large, trusting eyes. They surrounded me as if waiting for a command. I looked at them in surprise, not knowing what to do next, but Yorick came to the rescue again. "Take this herb and rub it on the rabbits." I did as he said. They didn't resist. In fact, they seemed pleased. After that, I released them, and they began to scatter in different directions. The scent of wolfsbane quickly spread throughout the castle courtyard. This smell caught the werewolf's attention. It howled like a mad creature and rushed after them. Its eyes gleamed with rage, and its claws tore at the ground as it chased the swiftly running rabbits. We took advantage of the situation and moved forward. We entered the castle through the massive gates, which opened with a prolonged creak. The inner courtyard turned out to be an abandoned garden. Overgrown paths, twisted stone benches, and bushes growing through cracks in the old tiles. Despite the neglect, the garden had its own strange, enchanting beauty. I couldn't help but admire the place, immersing myself in the atmosphere of the past, when I suddenly heard a voice. "Hey, buddy!" I looked around but saw no one. The voice was female, pleasant to the ear, but the source remained unknown. "Hey, buddy, can you help me?" It called out again. I looked around again but saw no one. Then the voice said, "I'm up here. Look up." I did as instructed and saw a young girl about my age entangled in vines in one of the trees. She looked exhausted, probably having spent all her energy trying to break free. I stared at her with curiosity, trying to understand how she got there. "Well, will you help me? I really need to use the bathroom," she said. I coughed awkwardly and climbed the tree. Carefully using a knife, I began to free her from the vines. After freeing her from the last vine, I grabbed her hand and helped her down. She started massaging her numb limbs, then, hopping from one foot to the other, disappeared around the corner. Soon she returned with a relieved expression on her face. "Thanks for saving me," she said, smiling. "I thought I was done for. My name is Eleanor." "Nice to meet you, Eleanor," I replied. "My name is Michael." We exchanged names, and I asked her what she was doing here. "I have some business here," she said, then suspiciously squinted and asked, "And what are you doing here?" "I also have some business here," I replied. We looked at each other with distrust until she sighed and said, "This won't do. Since you saved me, I'll tell you. I'm here looking for my grandfather." I noticed her unusual accent and asked, "Are you by any chance from England?" She tilted her head to the side and, looking at me, replied, "Well, actually, we're in England." "What?" I exclaimed, realizing that I might have been transported so far. She squinted and asked, "So what are you doing here? You obviously aren't local." "I have a little business here that I can't talk about," I answered evasively. "But how did you get tangled in the vines?" She looked up and shuddered in fear, saying, "I don't know. When I walked by, I got caught in a trap. The vines started wrapping around me as if they were alive and tied me to the tree. It was something unusual. People around here say this castle is dangerous, but I didn't think it was true." "Well, in any case you need to leave," I said. "This place is really dangerous." To my words, she merely tilted her head back and crossed her arms, clearly not intending to listen to me. I just shook my head and continued my way, and the girl followed. Seeing the skull in my hands, she noted, "You have a strange hobby." But I said nothing in response. I also noticed that she didn't see the ghost next to me, who was flying around us all the time. we continued our journey and found ourselves deep inside the castle. By all appearances, it was abandoned. The walls were covered with thick layers of dust and cobwebs. Ancient tapestries hung partially torn and faded by time. I started examining the rooms one by one. In one of them, I was struck by the sight. The room was large and spacious but sinister. Along its perimeter were numerous cages containing the skeletons of various animals. Each cage was made of black iron, some spots covered in rust. The skeletons were of all sizes and shapes, from small rodents to large predators. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light being a small window boarded up. Rays of light pierced through the cracks, casting eerie shadows of the cages and skeletons on the walls. The air was heavy and musty, filled with the smell of dust and age. Straw remnants and rags, which may have once served as bedding for the animals, lay scattered on the floor. In the corner stood an old wooden table covered with a thick layer of dust. On it lay tools and strange artifacts, clearly used for some dark experiments. Eleanor stood beside me, silently gazing at the grim scene. Her face expressed a mixture of horror and curiosity. "What is this place?" she whispered. I didn't know the answer myself. Yorick seemed deep in thought, his empty eye sockets glowing faintly. "This place," he began, but his voice trailed off and he fell silent. We cautiously approached the cages, examining the skeletons. Each cage had a plaque with mysterious symbols and inscriptions, likely describing the animals that had once been kept there. Suddenly, one of the skeletons in a nearby cage moved, producing a creaking sound. Eleanor screamed and stepped back, and I instinctively grabbed my knife. Yorick finally spoke again. "This place was used for dark experiments. The animals here underwent cruel magical experiments. We need to be careful." After Yorick's words, Eleanor looked at me with an open mouth, trying to understand if I was playing a trick on her or not. When she saw that the skull was talking, she probably thought it was some kind of trick. But then she screamed when Yorick turned to her and asked, "What's the matter?" I thought she would run away, but she pulled herself together, bowed to the skull, and asked, "What's your name?" Her reaction surprised me. This girl was very brave. Yorick introduced himself and asked why she was looking for her grandfather here. Eleanor began her story. "My grandfather was always fascinated by various supernatural things. When I was little, about 5 years ago, he disappeared. People searched for him for a long time but couldn't find him. I couldn't forget him and missed him very much. Recently, I found his old journal and noticed some notes mentioning this place. I decided to check it out. That's why I'm here." We listened to her story in silence, and I felt something tighten in my heart. She spoke sincerely, and her pain was palpable. We continued our search, examining rooms for clues but finding nothing of value. Then the ghost, as if sensing something, led us onward. My new companion kept watching me closely, but said nothing. We climbed to the second floor and headed toward the tower. We needed to go through a corridor, but in front of us was a door. Opening it, we saw a room filled with magic and mysteries. The room was spacious and dimly lit, with walls covered in ancient symbols and runes. In the center of the room was a large round table, covered with various magical items, ancient books, candles, crystals, and amulets. Around the table stood tall wooden cabinets filled with scrolls and manuscripts. Paintings depicting scenes from myths and legends, some of which looked like magical traps, hung on the walls. In the corner of the room, 5 glowing orbs floated in the air. Sensing the room's magical energy, Yorick said, "This is a trial. You need to complete it on your own. I can't always give hints." Activate all 5 orbs using the magical items on the table. Eleanor and I approached the table and began our examination. Carefully studying the symbols on the orbs, I noticed the intricate patterns that intersected and intertwined with each other. "Look," I said, showing Eleanor one of the orbs. "These patterns seem to represent elements: fire, water, earth, air, and spirit. We need to figure out how to combine them." Eleanor nodded and focused on one of the scrolls. Unrolling it, she read aloud. "To open the way, combine the power of the elements. Find the true combination, and release the light." We began searching for items that might correspond to the elements. On the table, we found a candle, a bowl, a stone, a feather, and an amulet, each decorated with a crystal of a specific color. But how to use them together? I noticed another item on the table, a strange device with 5 indentations arranged in the shape of a star. "Maybe this is the key," I suggested. We started experimenting, placing the crystals in different indentations. Each time we made an incorrect combination, the orbs dimmed and emitted a menacing hum. It was not as easy as it seemed. We had to figure out the correct combination of elements. After several attempts, Eleanor noticed, "Look, the patterns on the orbs change depending on how we place the crystals. Maybe that's a clue." We began to carefully observe the changes in the patterns. Finally, I realized the elements must be combined so that the patterns on the orbs become complete. It's like a puzzle. We started over, carefully matching the combinations. When we found the correct arrangement of crystals, the patterns on the orbs merged into a single whole, and the orbs glowed brightly. The room filled with a soft radiance, and a portal appeared in the center. "Excellent work," said Yorick. "Now we can proceed to the tower." I noticed that Eleanor wasn't surprised by the appearance of the portal. I also recalled how quickly she composed herself when she saw the talking skull. Something was off. It seemed like she was hiding something. But I decided not to dwell on it for now. We stepped into the portal, and when we emerged on the other side, I realized the ghost hadn't come through with us. Perhaps it stayed in the other room, unable to pass through. We found ourselves in a large circular room that looked like a wizard's chamber. The ceiling was high above us, adorned with intricate carvings and frescoes depicting scenes of ancient magical rituals. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with ancient tomes and scrolls, each one seeming to be a treasure trove of magical knowledge. In the center of the room was a massive wooden table, covered with various magical artifacts, crystals, amulets, potions, and alchemical tools. On the table lay a large map, covered in strange symbols and marks that seemed to move and change their locations. Against one of the walls stood tall, massive cabinets with glass doors, displaying various magical items and mineral collections. In the corner of the room was a large cauldron suspended over a fireplace, slowly boiling some potion, filling the room with the scent of herbs and spices. Near the table we saw a skeleton. As we approached, Eleanor suddenly screamed, "That's my grandfather!" She saw a ring on his hand and realized it was indeed him. Tears streamed down her face. I tried to comfort her while I examined the room, trying to figure out where the memory stone could be. We continued searching the room, and sometimes Yorick would tell me to take a certain item and put it in the pouch. This pouch turned out to be unusual. It had an inner subspace, and no matter how many things we put in it, it never filled up. We found many useful items, but there was no sign of the stone. I looked at the skeleton next to which Eleanor was sitting and noticed it seemed to be reaching for something. Following its gaze, I realized something might have rolled under the cabinet. I lay down and saw a peculiar blue stone on the floor beneath it. Reaching out, I grabbed it and began to examine it. This thing was mesmerizing. The stone was extraordinarily beautiful. Various silvery inclusions shimmered on its surface. I was in a trance and didn't notice as my vision blurred. I found myself in the same room, but everything seemed cleaner, as if I had traveled back in time. There were 2 people in the room. One I recognized immediately. It was the ghost. The other man was older. They were working at the table, conducting experiments. The ghost was called Archibald. At least that's how the older man addressed him. Between experiments, they were discussing something. Suddenly, the vision blurred, and it seemed much time had passed. I saw the 2 men arguing with each other. The older man was accusing Archibald of madness and telling him to stop. Archibald refused to agree. The older man slammed the door and left. The vision blurred again. I was back in the same room. In its center was the blue stone, and opposite it stood Archibald, reading some incantation. Suddenly, the older man burst into the room. A dispute began, escalating into a fight. "Archibald, you will unleash evil upon the earth," shouted the older man. "I can control it," Archibald stubbornly replied. In the midst of their struggle, they didn't notice the stone glowing brightly. It threw them to the sides. Archibald seemed to dissolve into the air, disappearing in the flash. The older man fell, then got up and approached the stone. A cloud above him formed, from which a hand emerged, reaching for the man. He managed to grab the stone and pull it from the altar. The hand struck him, and the man fell, injured. The stone rolled under the cabinet, and the cloud dissipated, the hand vanishing with an angry screech. The vision faded, and I was back in the same room, holding the blue stone. Around me were the familiar, slightly dusty walls and objects. So that's what happened here. Eleanor looked at me with wide eyes. I stood there holding the stone before me when suddenly the ghost of Archibald emerged from the wall. He floated toward the stone in my hand as if in a trance. I didn't know what to do and, frankly, didn't even have time to react. Archibald reached the stone and a flash occurred. In place of the ghost, a ghostly demon filled the room. Roaring furiously, it moved toward us. Eleanor and I managed to move to the other side of the room, but it seemed like we were done for. Suddenly, I remembered the amulet I found in the ruins. I pulled it out and held it up. The amulet shone with a bright light, and the demon recoiled, roaring in pain. It flew out the window, leaving a trail of smoke and fury behind. I ran to the window and saw the creature flying toward the village in the distance. I was scared, realizing what this could mean for the villagers. "What have we done?" I asked in despair. Yorick, appearing beside me, said, "You need to go there and help." I nodded, understanding that we had no other choice. We ran toward the village, constantly looking around, fearing that the werewolf might return. But luckily it didn't. The journey to the village took some time, and all the while, I felt a growing sense of unease. When we finally reached the village, I saw that the creature had already begun wreaking havoc. The strangest thing was that the villagers couldn't see it. To them, it seemed like some sort of natural disaster. The demon, invisible to their eyes, was tearing roofs off houses, destroying walls and uprooting trees. People were trying to escape, panicked. I stood there stunned, watching the scene, not knowing what to do. Chaos reigned around me. Screams, the crash of collapsing houses, the cries of children, and the noise of fleeing people. I saw one house collapse as if struck by an invisible giant, and my hands trembled at the realization that we had unleashed this evil. I remembered my bag and began frantically searching for anything that might help us. In the bag, I found a piece of chalk. I picked it up and asked Yorick, "What do I do with this?" "Yorick, glowing with a bluish light, replied, "Draw a pentagram to trap the demon." I nodded and ran to the road, hoping to find a suitable spot. On an open area, I began drawing the pentagram, following Yorick's precise instructions. The chalk glided over the ground, leaving clear lines that formed a 5-pointed star within a circle. Yorick guided me, indicating the exact places where the lines should be drawn. "Start with the central circle, then draw the star connecting its ends," he said. "Then surround the star with a larger circle. Make sure the lines are clear and unbroken." When I finished drawing, Yorick continued, "Now place the light amulet in the center." I carefully placed the amulet in the center of the star, and it began to glow, filling the pentagram with a soft light. Yorick said, "We need to lure the demon here, but we must act quickly and carefully." I returned to Eleanor, who was watching the demon as it continued to destroy the village. We began attracting the demon's attention, shouting and waving our arms. I held the amulet above my head so the light would be visible from afar. "Hey, over here!" Eleanor shouted, her voice full of determination. "Come here, beast!" The demon noticed us and, roaring, moved in our direction. We ran to the pentagram, trying not to lose sight of it. When we reached the spot, I stood at the edge and tried to lure the demon with the amulet's light. "Come on over here!" I kept shouting, trying to keep its attention. The demon approached, its eyes burning with fury. It stepped into the pentagram, and at that moment the amulet's light intensified, filling the drawing. The demon stopped as if hitting an invisible barrier. "Now," Yorick shouted, "seal it inside!" I took the chalk and quickly closed the final circle, completing the pentagram. As the demon was trapped, it struggled fiercely, fighting with all its might. I feared it might break free, but suddenly we heard the sound of footsteps. I turned and saw Mr. Mortimer approaching with a cane in his hand. He walked around the pentagram, examining the demon as if he were in a museum. He muttered something and nodded his head. Then he began striking the pentagram with his cane, and its light intensified and then began to contract, squeezing the demon. It roared in fury and pain. The circle shrank more and more until there was a flash. The same blue stone fell to the ground. Suddenly, Eleanor appeared next to him. She seemed to casually, as if just passing by, bend down and pick it up. Then, holding it in front of her, she started examining it. She turned to me and, smiling, said, "It's quite beautiful," before slipping it into her pocket and saying, "Thank you and forgive me. Maybe we'll meet again." After that, smoke flared up under her feet, and when it cleared, she was gone. I stood there trying to understand what had happened. I ran up to him, apologizing, and said, "Sir, forgive me, I didn't think she would do that. Don't worry, I had a feeling this might happen." "You know her?" I was surprised. "She's from an organization that doesn't get along with me very well," he replied without elaborating. I didn't understand what he meant, but I just nodded. "But what are you doing here?" "I sensed that you needed my help, so I decided to drop by," he answered, calmly looking at me. And it turns out I was right. After that, I briefly told him everything that had happened. He just nodded slightly and told me I had done well. Yes, but I lost the stone. Who was that girl? It was time to go home. My boss opened a portal, and we found ourselves back in our shop. As the portal was almost closed, a werewolf, the same one from the castle, jumped out of it. We stood there looking at each other. I was afraid to make any sudden moves because this creature was truly terrifying. Meister Mortimer, on the other hand, just calmly watched the werewolf, scratching his beard and muttering, "Interesting, interesting." I turned my head, trying to figure out if I was about to embark on another mission.